I first began coming to China in early 1989. For 30 years, I've witnessed the country becoming the second largest economy in the world. Once a backward economy and a closed society, China is now engaged openly with every country on earth. This year, 2018, marks 40 years of China's reform and opening up, a historic era of economic dynamism and social development. Looking to the past, what challenges were faced? What obstacles were overcome? Looking to the future, what lessons to learn, what principles to apply? Watch our special series on Closer to China, 40 years and counting. In this 40th year of China's reform and opening up, President Xi Jinping calls for comprehensively deepening reform and further opening up. That's why we title this series 40 Years and Counting, Transforming Reform and Opening Up for the New Era. What lessons have been learned? What challenges lie ahead? In this episode on economic reform, we explore rural reform, which was the cradle of reform, and state-owned enterprise, SOE reform, an area of continuing controversy. Why has rural reform taken so long? What is it about rural reform that year after year makes it a perennial topic at political meetings? Why have social disparities, especially gaps between urban and rural areas, been growing wider, exacerbating China's most invidious and intractable problems? On SOE reform, what has been its history, especially in recent years, and what are current SOE issues and questions? Both rural reform and SOE reform require new thinking for the new era. From China's experiences of 4 decades of reform and opening up, what insights can be gleaned for what's needed now? That's how we get closer to China. Population growth combined with a stagnant economy resulted in food shortages, and years of collective farming in people's communes devastated the farmers. All these factors became the rationale for rural reform, starting in Xiaogansun village, Anhui province in the late 1970s. 6 months after their common farmland was subdivided into family plots under the household responsibility system, the families reaped a very productive harvest. Yan Jinchang was one of the original farmers.
All the facts prove that we were able to make changes. Our pursuit of a better life is the drive to overcome all barriers.
The Farmers' Initiative was recognized by the provincial government. Their household responsibility system, which allowed farmers to subcontract land and reap the harvests, was soon implemented across the entire country. It helped emancipate people's minds and greatly enhanced productivity. Now, 4 decades later, China's rural reform has entered another new stage. Yan Jinchang and his fellow villagers are still contracting the farming land. At the same time, parts of Yan's fields are leased to a large pomegranate grower. The rent Yan receives from leasing his land, plus the salary Yan earns as a worker on the pomegranate farm, combine to make him one of the richest people in the village.
I am good at all kinds of work in the fields. My skills and their management are bringing me an even better life.
People's better lives is the goal of China's reform. China vows to revitalize its rural areas with thriving businesses, pleasant living environments, social etiquette and civility, effective governance and prosperity. At this new starting point to revitalize China's rural areas, I meet with Chen Xiwen, who studied China's rural issues for about 40 years and has been one of the country's top rural policymakers for nearly 20 years. I ask about policies to make rural revitalization not just a slogan, but a reality. I speak with leading Chinese economist Fang Gan and with one of China's leading rural experts, Zhang Xiaoshan. I ask why, in China, after 40 years of reform, are rural issues still a continuing problem? So as we look to the future, why is it important to look to the past, to understand the last 40 years of reform and opening up in order to have better insights in how to deal with the new era of new kinds of reform and opening up?
In terms of how our rural land reform unfolded, I believe that three aspects of this experience deserve our attention. First, in my opinion, farmers embraced the theory of property rights to carry out reform. The household contract system is in fact aimed to separate contracted management rights from collective ownership rights, which turned a unitary right into rights divided into several subfields. In reality, this was how we evolved into a property rights system. Second, after the household contract system was established for farmers, the means of production could soon belong to individuals or be owned by contracted households. That gradually led to the foundation of the socialist market economic system. Continue with public ownership at its heart while allowing all types of ownership to develop. It was rural reform that triggered all of this. Third, the farmers who contract collective land must first fulfill obligations to the state. For a certain portion of the land, the state determined what to produce. With the remaining part, farmers could decide for themselves what to grow, in response to market demand or whatever might sell best. Thus, reform introduced a market mechanism. It's fair to say that from the outset, farmers championed this new socialist market.
I think the biggest lesson from past 40 years was how important of the institutions we call it. How the institutional reforms are important to the economic growth and development. Actually, the best example was the rural reform in the very beginning of the 40 years. The so-called household contract system to replace the commune system. Like what we economists do in the economic modeling, everything else is given. At that time, everything else is given. The same people, the same land, the same capital, the same education, no change, and the same technology, only one thing changed, the institution.
It's a perfect economic experiment.
That's right. And in 2 years, China said bye-bye to hunger to solve this problem of the agricultural basic supply of the food. So, and whole other things, in the past 40 years just show, the change, the reforms can improve the efficiency, and that's why it's contributed to the economic growth. So that we need to learn.
It's 40 years since reform, and people are still talking about rural problems. Why in China are rural issues such a continuing problem?
We continue to emphasize the importance of agricultural, rural, and farmer issues. Though they've witnessed significant progress over the past 10 years, some core fundamental issues have yet to be addressed, like deep-rooted vested interest, distribution of national income, and institutional and systemic issues. What is the biggest asset for farmers? It's their collectively owned land. As members of a community, endowing farmers with more property rights also means enabling them to gain more value-added benefits from these lands.
Are there other modalities or mechanisms that can be brought to play to also reduce the gap?
In terms of household or individual income, I believe the most important way to bridge the urban-rural gap is to continually reduce the number of farmers by getting more of them to non-agricultural sectors. That would enable those remaining rural farmers to manage more and more land. This is the fundamental way out, but takes a long time. Second, the state must set up a protection system for agriculture, tailored to the current stage of development, which would guarantee farmer incomes, respond effectively to natural disasters, support infrastructure building, such as large-scale water conservation projects, and meet agricultural training demands. The state should have relevant designs on each front.
What is the overall reason that coming to sort of an optimum structure for rural areas has taken so long?
I believe we must identify a basic framework, or bottom line, of China's reform because we have our core values. We intend to follow a socialist road, but with Chinese characteristics, not other roads. The modifier socialist road with Chinese characteristics already commits us to not breach certain bottom lines, such as the collective land ownership system or collective economic organizations in rural areas. Second, farmers welcome the household contract system. We must stick to this system as we consider it the basic management system of the rural areas.
Socialism with Chinese characteristics is ultimately a people-centric approach, aiming to both improve people's well-being and serve their interests. Regarding the rural areas and farmers, the decisions of the third and fourth plenary sessions of the 11th CPC Central Committee included two critical sentences. We must be fully concerned with their material interests economically and effectively protect their democratic rights politically. Without material interests and democratic rights, it would be difficult to motivate citizens. Second, while guaranteeing certain rights, we must create a system or mechanism that frees up the development of individual creativity in all aspects and employs people properly. Third, we must base our system on equality and fairness to further unleash economic efficiency and vitality. We must have a bottom line that ensures that vulnerable groups, including impoverished rural residents, can still lead a dignified life. The society should have a fair starting point, aimed to develop all classes, marches toward a moderately prosperous society in all respects, and ultimately leads to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This, in my understanding, is socialism with Chinese characteristics.
While agricultural reform in rural areas was initiated by farmers, literally at the grassroots, industrial reform in urban areas was directed by government. When reform started, all enterprises in China were state-owned. All prices of goods were set by government, and all distribution of goods was controlled by government. But as reform progressed, the government's role gradually diminished, including in the operations of state-owned enterprises. Indeed, the reform of SOEs accelerated China's economic transformation. There have been many twists and turns in SOE reform. We've not likely seen the last of them, and debates were rarely placid. Most important, private business was allowed to flourish, playing an increasingly vital role in the country's economy. But let no one call the transformation complete. This private enterprise in China is one of IKEA's largest LED suppliers, and its products are exported to European and South American countries. However, given increasing downward pressure on the economy and a changing complex situation at home and abroad, China's businesses are grappling with lackluster growth and financing difficulties.
From 2017 to 2018, the real economy has met many difficulties. Many entrepreneurs think that private enterprises will be abandoned while only SOEs will get support. But I don't agree with such an opinion. I think that at the national level, SOEs and private enterprises are the same. They are all the sons of the country. SOEs could hardly bolster China's economic progress on its own. Private enterprises are irreplaceable.
40 years ago, there was no private business in China. Today, China's private sector has become a vital part of the economy. The private sector contributes 50% of tax revenue, 60% of gross domestic product, 70% of industrial upgrades and innovation, 80% of total employment, and 90% of the total number of enterprises. In 2014, 30 entrepreneurs from both private and public sectors in Fujian province jointly sent a letter to President Xi Jinping, putting forth suggestions on how to further and accelerate economic reforms. Mr. Huang Wenlin, in his 80s, was the writer of the letter. He changed the draft 8 times before handing it to the entrepreneurs for signing.
We would like to deliver a core message, that is, the entrepreneurs of the new generation are bold in taking the responsibility of continuing reform.
In his reply, Xi Jinping praised the entrepreneurs for their excellent performance in economic construction, and he urged them to keep up the momentum.
I think this is an exhortation, And I especially agree with the point which says uniting to achieve mutual benefits. To reach this goal, I think we should form complete industrial chains, which will be headed by large leading enterprises and which can drive small and medium-sized ones forward. In addition, I think it is time to build industrial clusters having critical mass effect, which will form an ecosystem that is fit for manufacturing.
Reform and continuous reform. These are the forces pushing China's economic rise over the last 40 years. In 1984, it was also from Fujian that economic reform in urban areas gathered momentum. Back then, 55 plant directors and managers published an appeal in Fujian local newspapers, asking government to release its power over factories.
The most fundamental reason for writing the appeal was that the old economic system seriously hampered the development of enterprises at the time.
From an industrial backwater in 1978, China is now known as the world's factory. The appeal in 1984 marked the rise of entrepreneurship, and the letter in 2014 catalyzed further enterprise reform, essential in today's new era. To discuss how China will further carry out SOE reform, I speak with Song Ning, former Deputy General Manager of China General Technology, and Song Xiaowu, former President of the Academy of Macroeconomic Research under the National Development and Reform Commission, which is responsible for formulating and implementing strategies of national economic and social development. Let's dig deeply into state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and start with the different phases that SOE reform has taken, beginning right at the beginning of reform and opening up in 1978 and beginning of the 80s. So what were the different stages that we can look to?
改革是从基层、从企业的意见反映起来的。
Reform was initiated at the grassroots, with suggestions from the enterprises themselves. Back then, there was a famous case where 55 factory managers in Fujian asked for free rein from the government. Until then, even major state enterprises, like the Daqing oil field company, for example, had to ask the government for permission for matters as minor as building a restroom. How then could entrepreneurs be motivated to grow their own business? That's why the state went on to delegate such powers as decision rights on finance, human resources, and pricing. That was during the primary stage, from the early to late 1980s.
80年代中后期。
From both the CPC's 14th National Congress in 1992 and the third plenary session of the 14th Central Committee in 1993, a clear path was charted on how to reform China's economic system. Specifically, to build a market economy with socialist characteristics, the state-owned enterprises gradually joined this path of marketization as well. How were the SOEs reformed? And in which direction were they reformed? As that third plenary session decided, the SOE reform was to include clearly defined property rights, a specifying of their rights and responsibilities, separation of ownership from daily management, and adopting a scientific management approach to the modern enterprise system. The most significant of these 4 points was to separate ownership from management because it underscored the point that these state-owned enterprises were actually no longer affiliated with the government administration.
One outstanding issue in the 94 reform was state enterprise reforms.
1998 to 2001 was that critical period.
That was the critical period, but it starts with the strategy of taking control of the big and letting go of the small. But de facto it meant that a large share of the urban labor force basically became unemployed or had to seek other employment, and those were very, very tough periods. Yeah. But it did make China's economy far more competitive, and together with the measures on the trade front, on the terror front, and on the foreign investment front.
What were some of the institutional reforms that have worked in the past in the industrial areas?
Institutional reforms allowing the private sector to grow up. Private sector, started in the 80s. in different forms, and it grow. At the beginning, it's very little, say 5%, 10%. And in the late 90s, it grew up to 70% of the GDP contribution. Only, using something like 30% of the capital investment. It's the most dynamic part of the economy. So that's we need to keep in mind. You may not to reform or change the state-owned enterprises, just to allow the private sector to grow, a new sector to grow, and eventually they will take part. They will change the environment for the state enterprises reforms.
So private enterprises say in China sometimes that although theoretically they have an equal weight to state-owned enterprises, in practical fact they do not.
Indeed, this problem exists. In reality, private enterprises encounter a glass ceiling that's seemingly invisible, even though we often speak about fairness, market competition, and survival of the fittest. Like the bank loan, many private enterprises are small or medium-sized enterprises. Globally, banks prefer to grant loans to large, reliable enterprises. In general, small and medium-sized enterprises face greater risks.
We interviewed lots of companies, and they basically said, look, we're not seeking areas of, we're not going into sectors where there is state dominance, even though we know we're better, but we will never win that competition. So even though we're more productive, we could make a lot more profit, we could employ more people, we will never win that competition, so we don't go there. And that's a loss for China. That's a loss for China because it means that the allocation of resources within China is not as efficient.
You want the best Chinese companies to survive and prosper and grow and create the best environment, and they would be the best competitors to the foreign companies. If too many Chinese companies are protected, then you have a very unconcentrated market, and none have the power to compete.
Great. Definitely, that's an issue. For developing country, you need some time to let your so-called infant industry grow up, but you cannot always be infant. You have to grow up. You have to be come to the real world of competition. So that's true. That's why China come to a stage of changes. So new era for us is a new era of competition, new era of more innovation, self-innovation, not only learn, not only follow others, but you also the new era of fairness of market environment, business environment.
Some people wonder, how can the market economy play a decisive role and state-owned enterprises play a dominant role? Is that a contradiction?
It's a basic economic principle of the primary stage of socialism. Public ownership dominates, but allows for all types of ownership to develop. There's no argument about it. Second, the portion of state-owned economy has already decreased. In fact, but that doesn't mean that we've embraced capitalism. State ownership of 30% or 40% can still guide the economy from a dominant position, even if it doesn't comprise the majority of the economy. On this question, we still need more in-depth analysis during the process of deepening SOE reforms.
What are some of the core areas that China needs to focus on in order to make the next breakthrough? Because, President Xi uses these big words. He says comprehensively deepening reform. Doesn't seem like it's just step by step. I mean, there's some big things that need to happen.
I think the competitive sectors then depends on whether the state-owned firm can perform well. If they can perform well, they can expand. If they could not perform well, they will shrink, and they will even be acquired by the private sectors. Right. But in the strategically important sector, financial monopoly sectors, I think the issue is how to enhance the effectiveness of the supervision. Because if you're in the monopoly sectors, it's so important. And this sector is going to a monopoly rent. And for the firms, certainly they will relax, and they want to enjoy larger monopoly rent at the cost of the well-being of the people. And then we need to...
Everybody tries that.
Yeah, then we need to enhance the supervision. Privatization is not an answer. I think it's the most important how to enhance the supervision. And for the statistically important sector which need to be subsidized in any country. And again, is how to really supervise them.
Looking forward, what are the major challenges for SOE reform going forward?
SOE reform may face a long road ahead, perhaps even longer than the road we've come so far. General Secretary Xi Jinping has set the goals for SOE reform to build first-class enterprises and to establish a new system for modern enterprise management. From the status quo of how SOEs operate today, though, I think they generally lack vitality. Compared with many first-class enterprises around the world, China's SOEs lag behind in terms of their governance, influence, capacity to innovate, and ability to compete in the market. These are the challenges that SOE reform faces.
Over the past 40 years, SOE reform has been a crucial component of China's overall reform. It's interwoven with the entire basic economic system. For China's reform to work, it relies on successful ownership reform. That requires market-linked entities to grow in a fair, orderly, open, and competitive market environment. So I believe the general direction for SOE reform is clear. In light of our consistent guiding principles, SOEs can no longer enjoy special state subsidies and privileged policies. When it comes to public interests, public security and other national interests, SOEs have a significant role to play. In competitive industries, however, SOEs must compete fairly on a level playing field with non-state enterprises. It's crucial that we allow SOEs to learn to swim or to drown in the vast ocean of the market economy.
Since 1978, China has become a laboratory for reform, a pioneer in the long process of transforming a planned economy in which the state was supposed to own all the means of production into a market economy in which mixed ownership features a vibrant private sector. China's economic success, in no small measure, can be attributed to a series of strategies: setting visionary goals, experimentation that allows local bottoms-up innovation and variation, reassessment that includes a willingness to make changes, and the institutionalization of central top-down policies based on experience. There is, of course, unfinished business. At the 19th CPC National Congress in late 2017, the party outlined a national strategic plan for rural vitalization. By 2035, modernize the farm sector, boosting rural incomes and living standards. This will require fundamental reforms for farmers, both rural property rights and residency registration (hukou) rights. While it was about 40 years ago when the household contract system in rural areas unleashed farmers' productive power and ushered in China's reform, it was about 30 years ago that ownership rights in state-owned factories injected vitality into industry, triggering the country's high-speed economic growth. But to maintain economic momentum today, to increase efficiency and productivity, new SOE reforms are needed, surely in management, likely in ownership, possibly in control. There is common agreement that the market must play a recently crowned decisive role in resource allocation, but whether SOEs should play a continuing dominant role in many industries, as has been stated, remains controversial. In the next episode, we explore China's government reform and governance reform to be closer to China.